All right, I think we'll get going now. So thank you everybody very much for attending. Today's webinar is going to be on the topic of identifying and reporting the spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven using the New York iMapInvasives network. Just a few reminders before we get started. Everybody is muted. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can go ahead and put them into the chat window. We have a representative from iMapInvasives monitoring the chat, and at the end of the presentation, you can stick around and we'll go through any remaining questions to answer any questions people might have. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. Anybody who has registered for the webinar and is attending will get an email after the fact that has a link to the recording of it, as well as any other links that we might mention throughout the presentation. And just one comment on audio. Tom, if you're there, can you just let me know if my audio is coming through all right?
I can hear it fine. Yep.
Okay, so if anybody's having any audio issues, just try refreshing the page or adjusting your audio on your computer. So, get started. So today's speakers, we have Tom Allgaier, the Invasive Species Coordinator from the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, who's going to be talking about spotted lanternfly and the tree of heaven. And then I'm Douglas Knopf from the New York Natural Heritage Program's iMapInvasives team, and I will be talking a little bit about IMAP as well as how you can contribute data to the database through our Spotted Lanternfly Grid Square program. So a quick rundown of how it's going to go today, an introduction, and we'll have Tom talk about the two focal species and then talk about reporting to the database after that. So a little bit of background about organization. The New York Natural Heritage Program facilitates the conservation of rare species throughout the state. And as one of the biggest threats to rare species is the establishment and spread of invasive species, the iMapInvasives program operates within that organization. And we provide the official invasive species database for New York State, as well as a host of data collection tools, including the mobile app, iMap Mobile Advance, and the WISPA app, and also several data analyses tools, such as spatial prioritization models, to help our partners use the data that we have in our database to steer their management prioritizations. So the reason that spotted lanternfly is such a important and focal species for us is because it is such a widespread and generalist invasive. It has a very wide range of native plants that it will feed on that has high possibility for both ecological damage as well as economic damage for many of the agricultural products across New York State, including vineyards and orchards across the state with very high potential for economic damage. There's also high potential for damage to like residential areas and both in urban, suburban, and rural parts of the state. This is a species that can really affect all parts of the state. So we have this widespread collaborative effort throughout New York State to track the spread and try to prevent the continued spread and establishment of the species. So this is an effort that includes many of the different state agencies, including the DEC, Ag and Markets, DOT, Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, many of our invasive species partners throughout the state, including partnerships for regional invasive species management, many different volunteer groups, public interest groups, as well as you. If you are here, then you show an interest in invasive species, and you can be a part of the effort by contributing data on spotted lanternfly or tree of heaven in your area of the state. And then before we get started into the species ID portions, just a little bit about the data that we've collected so far this year. So for the iMapInvasives Grid Square program, which has been going on since early June and I'll talk a little bit more about that after Tom introduces the species. But we've had 44 grid squares claimed throughout the state, and these are just a few metrics of the information that we've collected from these grid squares and a rough distribution of where the data has been coming in. And a special thanks to anybody who has been contributing data for these species throughout the season so far. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Tom Algeier to talk about spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven.
Good morning, or afternoon, I should say, everyone. As Doug mentioned, I'm the invasive species coordinator here with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, specifically within the Division of Plant Industry. So here's a nice shot of the fourth instar nymphs, which we shouldn't be seeing too many of at this point, but we can go to the next slide. So my agency, New York State Ag and Markets, is the lead agency, not the only agency, as Doug mentioned, for spotted lanternfly, mostly because it's an agricultural pest. And we do have a reporting page here that you can use. There's additional information there available on our website. So next page. So spotted lanternfly is native to China and Southeast Asia. It's also invasive in other parts of the world like India and South Korea. So it's not native to all of Asia. It was first discovered in North America in Pennsylvania, in Berks County, Pennsylvania in 2014, and it's slowly spread out since then. It uses its mouth parts, piercing, sucking mouth parts, to feed on the sap of more than 100 different plants. It prefers tree of heaven, which is Lanthus altissima, but the concern for us is grapes, hops, apples, maples, walnuts, raspberries, blueberries. The list goes on. So they don't bite, they don't sting, so they're not going to hurt people, but they are doing some damage to agricultural crops. So next page. As Doug mentioned, there's also some additional, more of a nuisance pest issue with the black sooty mold. So the feeding stresses the plants, making them vulnerable to other diseases and other insects and things like that. But they also produce this sticky, rich substance called honeydew. So it's their excrement, but it's also mixed with plant sap. So it's a very sweet, sugar-rich honeydew, very similar to what you would have with an aphid infestation. However, that honeydew rains down and covers everything underneath of it. You can see the steps here in the top left photo. The two top steps are black and slick looking. That has black honeydew. The bottom one has been power washed, just so you can see the contrast. The bottom left, you can see the black sooty mold growing on grape leaves, how it will block the light from penetrating and diminishing the plant's ability to photosynthesize. Large amounts of honeydew can start to ferment. You get these like frothy, foamy growths here. You can see at the base of that trunk of that tree, with many adults massed around. I apologize for any background noise here in the office. But the frothy foam can also attract stinging insects, as can the honeydew. So it's a quality of life issue. It could be a slip, trip, and fall issue. But in rural and suburban areas, it's really just a nuisance pest. So next page. As far as agricultural impacts, nationally, New York ranks third in grape production, and second in apple production. And we also have we're trying to reinvigorate our hops crop production as well. So the hop yards are being impacted as well. And we don't know the environmental impacts as far as forest and forest regeneration, as far as damage to young trees and reforestation. So that's still an unknown and question mark kind of thing. So, but they do not kill mature trees, but they can damage agricultural crops. So next page. So as of now, it's located in 17 states across the United States, including 27 counties in New York State. But as far west as Illinois, as far east as Massachusetts and all the way down to North Carolina and Tennessee, you can find some populations of spotted lanternfly. So just because the county is lit up in blue doesn't mean the entire county is covered in spotted lanternfly. It could be one population in one area of the county, or it could be the entire county, which would be the case, say, Nassau County or Westchester. However, in other counties, say Seneca, it's just one small location in one town. So the blue area looks very daunting, but when you take that into account, it's not as bad as it first seems. It's still bad, but not as bad as it seems. So next page. And when we zoom into the Cornell Integrated Pest Management map into New York, we can see here that, there's 24 counties, 25 actually as of today, but the map has not been updated to include Livingston County, I believe it was. So, yes, Livingston County. So, it was recently added this week. So, it continues to spread slowly but surely, despite all of our efforts. So, and it was first detected here in New York State in 2020. So, in the past 4 years, you could see it spreading from the lower part of the state, where it was first found in Richmond County, which is Staten Island, one of the 5 boroughs in New York City, and it slowly spread north and east from there, and now spreading west. So, next slide. So the life cycle, right now we're seeing the adults, and they can be seen as early as July, and they will be seen all the way through till the first heavy freeze. A frost will not kill them, it will slow them down, but they will still continue to move about and mate and lay eggs until the first heavy freeze. They will overwinter as eggs. The egg masses are shown there on the left. They look almost like sesame seeds lined up with a little line on them. The majority of them are covered in like this grayish putty covering. However, not all the egg masses will be covered, and they will overwinter in that stage, and then they will hatch out in as early as May, depending on where you are in the state. And when they first hatch out, they're really, really tiny, about the size of the dot after the word May. That's how small they are when they first hatch. They're really, really tiny. They will molt 3 times, still retaining that black and white color. And then the 4th time they molt, they'll develop these red wing pads or red markings on their wing pads. For that stage, they're about 1/4 of an inch, half an inch in diameter, and they're very easy to spot in the environment. They're plant hoppers, so they like to jump around. They can't fly at that stage. However, when they do mature, they will still hop. They prefer to hop over fly, but they are pretty good flyers. And then again, as the summer progresses, you get to the middle of the summer, the adults will emerge, and then the cycle begins all over again. So next page. And this just kind of shows us where we're at. That we will start seeing egg masses very shortly. I believe there was a couple locations on Long Island that actually had egg masses, but they weren't sure if they were old egg masses or new egg masses. But we're getting into egg laying season, and the adults are still out. You may see 1 or 2 still of the 4th instar nymphs, especially in some of the northern parts of the state where the temperatures really aren't as they haven't slowed down as much. So next page. So as I mentioned, the adults are still active. You're more likely to see them like this, the side profile view where the wings look slightly pinkish because the hind wings are red. The fore wings are translucent, and they have the little gray wings with black dots. They're really beautiful insects, and when they open up their wings, it's the typical butterfly look that everyone sees. But when their wings are folded, you can see that red kind of shine through a little bit. They're actually very beautiful little insects, but they're very destructive. So, next page. There's the butterfly-looking stage. It's not a butterfly. It's not even technically. It's not even a lanternfly. As I mentioned, they're plant hoppers. but you're not likely to see them very often with their wings spread like that in the environment, although it does happen, but you're more likely to see the adults on like there on the left, perched on that little grapevine. So, and it looks like he's leaning back on his back legs, getting ready to jump away. They love to jump. So, next page. The adults, they can camouflage themselves pretty well, so they're a little bit hard to see sometimes. As you can see, I'm guessing that's probably an oak tree, but there's lots of lichen growing on there, so they blend in pretty well in the environment. And I came across this little infographic that I borrowed with all the life stages on one little twig of Ailanthus, and you can see the egg masses on the underside of the branch, because that's where they like to lay their eggs, is in protected areas. And then they first hatch, they'll go through 3 molts. They'll molt 1/4 time, and then it'll finally emerge as an adult. So, next page. During the adult stage and also during the some of the juvenile stages, especially as an egg, they're easily transported. Unfortunately, that's how they get moved long distances rather than flying. They can fly relatively short distances, but to move great distances, they usually hitchhike. As you can see, this pickup truck here with the spotted lanternfly adult on the door pillar with the open window. It just takes a second for that to climb inside and, hitch a ride to a new location. The location in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was a camper that was moved from Pennsylvania to Illinois, was moved from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, out west. And when they moved their camper, they realized there was eggs that had hatched from underneath the camper. They like rusty metal, and they like protected areas to lay their eggs. So keeping that in mind if you're looking for egg masses. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So next page, please. Right now, you'll just starting to see some gravid females. A gravid female is one that's ready to lay her eggs. The one on the left there looks like she's about ready to pop. You can see those little pleats have expanded, and the yellow underside is exposed. You'll only see that in the females when they're ready to lay eggs. The one on the right, the pleats are still folded in a little bit, but you can still see that yellow underbelly, and she may have laid some eggs already, or she's just not quite ready yet. But that's a definite indication that the female is ready to start laying eggs. And we're starting to see this stage now, especially on Long Island in New York City. So, next page. As I mentioned, they're good at camouflage, and the egg masses are no different. I don't know if you can see that egg mass on that Ailanthus tree there. It may look like it's just a spot of mud, but if you go to the next click, it highlights it. There we go. And one more click. They can camouflage their eggs, but they also like to hide them. So you can see this cat facing or tree wound here that has some bark growing over the wound wood. It created a little shelter, and they've laid several egg masses underneath that bark. So just looking at the outside of the tree, you're like, oh, there's no eggs on there. Everything's good. Until you look under the peeling bark, and there's several egg masses hidden. So they like to do that. So not just on trees, but any flat object outside is vulnerable to egg mass laying. So next page. Here's another shot of egg masses and a female laying eggs on a tree of heaven. It's got that cantaloupe type bark to it, especially when they're young. The egg mass in the top left is covered already. It looks like she was interrupted as she was laying the egg mass on the right, because typically an egg mass has 40 to 70 eggs. That's certainly not a normal size egg mass, so she was probably disturbed while she was laying those eggs and walked away. But they'll often walk away after they've laid their eggs without covering them. Probably about 70% of them are covered, and 30% aren't. The majority of the egg masses, when they lay an egg mass, they're attracted to lay other egg masses in that same area. So pretty frequently you'll find just not a egg mass, but multiple egg masses. So next page. I mentioned that they were attracted to rusty metal, so when this car rim and tire were flipped over on the underside, on the rusty area, and even onto the rubber on the tire, there are multiple egg masses, and I think there's a couple more in there that aren't even highlighted. The top center photo has some of the dried egg mass covering. It looks almost like putty or almost like tree sap. And then on the bottom left, you can see some egg masses. The egg mass on the left of that picture looks like it had already hatched out a few. You could see the center line within the eggs is opened up, and that's an indication that those eggs have already hatched. So that was very early on when that started hatching. The other ones are still viable. So it's another way you can tell if it's an old egg mass or a viable egg mass. If they have that little hollow section in the middle, they've already hatched. They're an old egg mass. Next page, please. As I mentioned, they'll congregate egg masses. This barrel has two ribs. Underneath those ribs, there's multiple egg masses, and then once those areas are full, it kind of spills over onto the flat side of the barrel. Again, they're attracted to rusty metal and protected areas. On this birch tree, I'm guessing it's black birch. It could be something else, but it looks the bark looks very much like black birch. You can see an egg mass on top that blends in really, really well with those lenticels, and then also the covered egg mass on the bottom that stands out a little bit because of the coloring contrast. But the coloring of the egg masses, the covering, well, it starts off as white and kind of fades to tannish gray. And then I apologize for the noise in the background if you can hear that. So the egg mass coloring is not consistent in color or texture. They start off smooth and white, and then they kind of gradually turn gray and tan and get kind of crackled and bumpy looking. So it's very hard to describe that without seeing multiple pictures. So next page. Again, rusty metal, especially on things that move. Like this tractor trailer, nothing you could see without kind of craning your neck around and looking on the underside of that taillight housing. The underside of the taillight housing is covered with egg masses. However, the rest of the tractor trailer was free of egg masses, but that protected area underneath had quite a few egg masses. Again, railroad tracks, the underside of the railroad track, very hard to detect. That was actually one of the dogs from the Lower Hudson Prism. They're trained in invasive species detection, especially for spotted lanternfly, and they were able to detect that egg mass on the underside of the railroad track rail. A camp chair that was laying down on the ground was lifted up, and underneath there were multiple egg masses. And that's the kind of thing that scares us, because that piece of camping equipment or recreational equipment can be picked up and moved just like a canoe or an ATV or a trailer. And move from one location to another to spread these around. So if that camp chair was picked up and left at someone's camp up in upstate New York or in another area, instantly have a new population. So next page. So my take-home messages are that we're currently looking for eggs and adults, and we're starting to look for egg masses, looking for flat protected areas for egg masses. Think under and behind. Any flat surface is fair game. They do like rusty metal, though. And negative is good. I say that because if you look and don't find it, that's important to report in IMAP. That we know that area has been searched and nothing has been found. That is useful data. So negative is not always bad. Negative data, as far as survey, is actually very helpful for us because it can direct us to other areas that have not been searched. So. That's next slide. I think that's the end of my slides for that. Oh, so now we're going to jump into Tree of Heaven, which is the preferred host. Oh, back one. Go back one. Yep. So Tree of Heaven is the preferred host of spotted lanternfly, but not its only host. It can complete its life cycle on other trees. It doesn't need Tree of Heaven to complete its life cycle and become sexually mature. However, it does better. It produces better. It has it's more. It lays more eggs, and more of those eggs hatch if it feeds on Tree of Heaven. But it can survive on things like maple and walnut and other plants. So next page. The tree was first brought to North America in 1848 as an ornamental and shade tree. Many plantings were made in Pennsylvania, and a lot of those plants were carried out west for very fast-growing shade trees. It was also brought in as food for silk moth. They thought they would be able to be a viable host for silk moth production in the U.S. at that time. Western settlers, as I mentioned, carried the trees out there because they needed quick-growing shade trees. Curiously, the novel A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith, the tree that she's discussing is actually a tree of heaven, considered by many or most as a weed tree. However, some people do cherish this tree, mostly based on this book. So, next page. Tree of Heaven, of course, we're a government agency, so we have to have acronyms. So, if you see TOH, it's not it's Tree of Heaven, not Town of Hempstead. Its native range is China and Taiwan, which overlaps with spotted lanternfly, and so it has this host plant in its native range. It tolerates poor soils. It'll grow through in almost anything. You'll find it in urban settings and habitats, in disturbed areas, along construction sites, woodlots that are left to grow over, rail yards, industrial sites, cleared lots, the edges of construction areas that were left untouched. It'll often come up in those areas. It's not always a small tree. These can get quite large. The impacts of the tree are that it crowds out native species. It produces dense undergrowth. It colonizes an area, so it'll have many stems for the same root system. It shades out lots of other, it stops the seeds from growing, stops forest regeneration due to the shade. It also has allelopathic compounds which prohibit other seeds from germinating in the soil. It changes soil nutrient cycling. It can also damage buildings with its roots, as well as sidewalks. Next page. Here's a good example, the top photo there, a good example of a colony of Tree of Heaven. But again, it can be quite a large tree. You can see, some of those are probably 40, 50, 60 feet tall. They do grow to 80 feet. And as far as, I know there's one here that I pass every day on my way to work. And it's probably 30 inches in DBH, or diameter at breast height. So they can be quite large trees at sometimes. They also often grow in clumps, as I mentioned, because they have a heavy seed load and also because they're sprouting up from the roots. The common name comes because it grows towards heaven so quickly. Especially as a young tree, they grow vigorously, and they grow, several feet a year. So, next page. The leaf arrangement is, as I mentioned, is alternate. It's a tree identification tool. That either the leaves are in whorls, opposite, or alternate. This particular tree has alternate leaf placement, and at the base of each of the leaflets along each leaf petiole, because they have a compound leaf, you'll see this little nub or notch or thumb at the base of the leaf. That's a good indicator that it's Tree of Heaven, not one of the many lookalikes like black walnut or sumac, which are both hosts also. So just don't think, oh, it's a Tree of Heaven, I'm going to survey this, and it's one of the other lookalikes, I'm not going to survey that. It's still especially early in the spring, it's still worth taking a good look at the sumac and black walnut because they're also hosts. So next page. Here's a good example of a pinnately compound leaf. But these are, you can see the opposite, not alternate, so that would not be Tree of Heaven. So next page. Good examples of the thumbs, and the thumb has, I don't know if you can see it on the page on the left side, there's a little tiny gland at the base of that notch. Looks like a little dot, almost like an insect egg, but that's actually a gland at the end of the base there, on the base of that notch. So, next page. Seed production is prolific. You can see that they have single seed samaras and in large clusters, similar to maples, where maples have double samaras. These have single samaras, very much like an ash tree. However, the ash tree seeds, the seed is at the tip. The tree of heaven seed is in the center of the samara, and the seeds will change color throughout the season. When they start forming, they're green, as in the bottom left, and then they'll start to turn orange this time of year, which makes the female trees, because there's male and female trees, the seeds are only found on the female trees. The seeds are easy to spot this time of year, and as they dry off later in the fall, they turn brown, and the seeds will persist over the winter. So, next page. Another way to check is the pith. So the center part of the twig is a very soft tissue called pith. They have it's almost like a hollow cavity, and it smells like burnt peanut butter from what I've been told, although I've never burned peanut butter. I don't know what it smells like, but I can tell you it's not a pleasant smell. So if you break it open and have this acrid, unpleasant smell, and there's pith, it's probably tree of heaven. Sumac also has pith, but it does not have that same odor, and it's a tan, almost like a light peanut butter color as well. So, next page. The bark, as I mentioned earlier, is smooth like cantaloupe skin. When they're young, when they get older and the trees get much more mature, there's much more texture to the bark, and they're not quite as smooth. Next page. Again, talking about the twigs, here's a good comparison with the leaf buds and leaf scars. You can see walnut, tree of heaven, and sumac and horse chestnut are all pretty similar. However, sumac, the leaf scars are very small. Tree of heaven has very large, almost like a shield-like shaped leaf scar, where the walnut has a very small leaf scar. And the bud is at the top of that little shield. So, next page. Again, comparison of tree of heaven next to sumac. You can also see the petiole, the leaf stem on sumac is red, where tree of heaven it's not, and the tree of heaven will always have those notches. Sumac, the buds are very angular, and the segments usually between the leaf buds are very short, where it's much more elongated with tree of heaven. Sumac seeds, however, look very different. They're almost conical. They start off as green and they turn red, and then in the winter they're brown, as in that top center photo, and they're at the tips of the branches. And on the right, you can see a sumac, very dense foliage on the right, versus the tree of heaven growing in the background. So, but young tree of heaven and sumac do look very similar. So, but again, they're both hosts. So if you come across either one, you're still good to survey. So, next page. Another lookalike is walnut, particularly black walnut. You can find the fruits, the nuts themselves. They have a green mesocarp this time of year, and then eventually that will slough off and you'll have the nut underneath. However, the buds don't have that typical shield, and the leaf bud is in the middle of the leaf scar, not at the top. And these leaves, the leaflets are alternate versus opposite. And then in the spring, walnut is a preferred host of the juvenile nymph stage will be attracted to short, young walnut growth more so than tree of heaven, and then they migrate over to tree of heaven as they mature. So even if you come across a young walnut tree or an older walnut tree, that's still a good target for survey. So, next page. Ash is another one. I mentioned the seed similarity, but they also have a compound leaf. However, the ash will have 5 to 7 leaflets per leaf. Looks very different compared to tree of heaven, where I think there's usually 11 or more leaflets per for each petiole. So, next page. The ash seeds, as I mentioned, that's at the tip, right at the base of the petiole. And then the tree of heaven, the seed is in the middle of the samara. But when they're hanging in the tree and you're looking up, it's really kind of hard to tell. However, the tree of heaven is, like as I mentioned, prolific with seed production. There's usually a lot more seed present on a tree of heaven than there is in an ash tree. So, and there are also the ash tree samaras are usually thinner and more blade-like, where the tree of heaven are much wider. So next page. So again, my take-home message for tree of heaven is check your plants. So even if it's not, you don't think it's a host, it might be. So a tree of heaven is the preferred host, but they can be on many, many different plants, wild grapes, things like that, cucumbers, raspberries, figs, blackberries, blueberries, all sorts of vegetable crops. They've been found and cause damage to those plants as well. So just check all your plants. So next page. So for additional information, as I mentioned earlier on, we have our New York State Ag and Markets webpage, but there's also a Cornell Integrated Pest Management site for spotted lanternfly. There are management options there. There are ID options there. And there's also great information there about the biology of spotted lanternfly. And again, I'm available as a resource. You can always email me. But those two sites, especially the Cornell Integrated Pest Management site, has a wealth of information. So I think that's it for me, Doug.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. That was a lot of great information about those two species. And the final section for today's webinar, we're going to be hopping back into iMapInvasives to talk about how you can participate in our surveying efforts and monitoring efforts and submit data for these two species to our database. So just another quick overview of how our database functions. The main priority for it is to support our partner agencies and help them prioritize the work that they're doing for invasive species management. Besides just holding the data in our database, we have a number of different tools to help our partners accomplish these goals through things like species distribution models, automatic generated reports, email alerts if you have a certain species or area of interest that you want to get alerted for when new things show up. You can have highly customizable automatic alerts set up. Web map services if you have a website that you want to have a live snapshot of the iMapInvasives database. You can build that into your website directly, as well as tracking the monitoring efforts and the management efforts of our different partner organizations. So besides just presence data, as Tom mentioned, we want to also have not detected data. So presence being if you go out and you find something, whether you're surveying for it specifically or it's an incidental finding that you just happened upon an invasive species, you can report that. If you are specifically looking for a species and you don't find it, you can submit not detected data. That way the management experts know that these areas have been surveyed before. And we also have treatment data that we hold in our database. So if these agencies or partners are doing management to try to eradicate or control invasive species, they can record that information and see how the management is going over time. The way that the data goes into the iMapInvasives database, all the information put in initially comes in as unconfirmed. So when you first take a report of an invasive species and send it in, it'll show as unconfirmed. And then after it is reviewed by an expert, either at the iMapInvasives team or at one of our partner organizations, then it will show up as unconfirmed. And for certain species, data is initially hidden. So for things like spotted lanternfly, if it's in a brand new county or city in New York, it'll initially be hidden until the proper authorities can go out and check and either manage the population or confirm that it is there. And then it will show up on the main database. So the way that the data, the flow of the data looks on the left there, coming in as unconfirmed. For an ordinary species like tree of heaven, once it's logged by a user, people who have the ability to confirm these species will get an alert And once it is reviewed by an expert, if they say, yes, this is a tree of heaven that was reported, then it will show up publicly on the main map. And for species like spotted lanternfly that are confidential, email alerts go out to a select group of data reviewers. And then once they review it, then it will show up on the map. And then from there, if you have email alerts set up for these specific species, they will be sent out. So the monitoring efforts for spotted lanternfly have been ongoing for a very long time, several years in New York, and obviously New York is a very large state and the environmental professional world is rather small, so we always are looking for more eyes on the ground, more people to get involved in our surveying and monitor efforts so we can provide this extra data to our partners and help steer the prioritization of management. So the best way to do that is through one of the programs we have set up right now, the Spotted Lanternfly Grid Square survey program. And these are just the basic steps of how to do that. We'll go through each of these steps, but basically you make an account with the iMapInvasives database. You select an area that you want to survey for spotted lanternfly. You go out and you do these surveys and submit your data that you find. This is a program that we do throughout the summer, and throughout the summer and fall, there are 3 distinct survey seasons. This is between May 1st and June 30th, is where you're looking for the old egg masses and the early instars. The summer is where you find those 3 black instars, the 1 red instar, as well as starting to see some adults emerge. And then the fall survey season that we're in right now is where you can start to look for those egg masses that will be starting to be laid very soon. And even though that we are in the 3rd survey season, you can still get involved in this program. So if you're interested in signing up for a grid square, or even if you just, you don't want to do a grid square, or you want to do an area that isn't covered by the grid squares, and you still want to survey for these species, these are the steps that will help you get started in that. So to get started with an iMapInvasives account, you go to our main website, nyimapinvasives.org. There's a login button in the upper right that will help you either log into your existing account or create a new account. I also want to draw attention to this yellow banner right up here. That is a direct link that will bring you to the Grid Square page that has all of this information spelled out on it as well. So making an account is easy. If you already have an account, it's as simple as logging in. And then if you want to create a brand new account, all you need is a name, an email, password, and then jurisdiction is the state that you're operating in. So that would be New York. You hit join, it will send you an email to activate your account. And then after that, you are set to log in using the same page. Once you log in, you're met with the main page of the database that shows the main database map. If you want to sign up for a Spotted Lanternfly Grid Square, you will need your person ID number. So if you go to the upper left corner, that'll pull up the menu. You go to your account and you find this person number. This is the number you need in order to sign up for a square. So write that number down before you go into the next page. So this is the Grid Square map powered by ArcGIS Online. It has this grid overlaid over New York State with all of the priority areas. So we've worked with a lot of our partner organizations like Ag and Markets, Parks, Prism to prioritize these different 1 square kilometer grid squares to see where the efforts would be most important. So we have focus areas that we've deemed to be the most important in red, areas that have been recommended by the prisms, areas that are known to have the host plant tree of heaven growing in them, as well as areas that are just publicly accessible land. They're still good to survey. And like I had mentioned, if you want to survey an area that isn't covered by one of these squares, you are absolutely welcome to do so, and all data from anywhere in the state is still welcome and important. So before you go out and plan to do one of these surveys, after you've selected your grid square or location that you want to survey, it's important to choose what kind of tool you want to conduct the survey. So we have the online IMAP database that I showed. You can input data directly using that. If you go out and you don't find something, then you can just put down a data point in the database. If you go out and find something, you can take a picture of it, bring it back, upload it to your computer, or you access the database on the phone or mobile device, and you can input it that way. The easiest way to do it is using one of our mobile data reporting tools, either the mobile app or the Survey 123 form. So it's important to plan how you want to do it before you go out into the field. And the easiest method to do so, we recommend, is the iMapInvasives mobile app. This is designed to be the most beginner-friendly and user-friendly of our data collection tools. Very similar to the database and Grid Square map. All you have to do is sign into your account, your existing iMapInvasives account, using your username and password, and then hit Retrieve IMAP List, and that will log you into your account. This needs to be done with internet connection or good service, but after you are logged in and set up, you no longer need internet connection. You don't even need to have any cell service at all, and you can go out and do your invasive species surveys. So then you can go out into the field, do your surveys for either detected or not detected, depending on what you find in your survey area. And then once you're back home and you have internet connection, you can upload your records for whatever you found out in the field, and they will go into our database. It's very important to get good photos if you're going to be collecting any data out in the field. They need to be focused and close up enough that an expert can look at the photo and definitively say what species it is in the photo, as well as focusing on any identifying characteristics. So like Tom had mentioned, for a tree of heaven, those shield-shaped bud scars or the shape of the leaves in the tree of heaven are important to focus on so that the pictures can be confirmed. If you want any more information on how to use any of these data tools, what data tools are available, or how to report to iMapInvasives, you can go to nyimappinvasives.org/report, and that will give you a whole list of options of how you can report data to the database. So now you've got your tools ready, you know where you're going to do your survey. The last step is to go out and conduct the survey. So you have your 1 kilometer square grid if you're going to be participating in the Grid Square program. It's good usually to pick 1 to 3 spots throughout the grid to survey. Obviously areas that are publicly accessible and that can be accessed safely. So if we're doing this square right here, you don't have to worry about traveling all the way to the other side of the river to get this area over here. You can pick 1 to 3 areas in this main spot here, maybe staying off any private property that might be within the grid square. While you're there, survey for the 2 focal species, tree of heaven and spotted lanternfly. At this point in the year, it's good to survey for the spotted lanternfly eggs. So any flat surfaces, natural or man-made, like Tom had mentioned, any rusty metal or man-made surfaces are good, and tree of heaven are very commonly found in disturbed areas, as well as near like infrastructure or structures. They're the type of species that grows out of a crack in the sidewalk, so they can be really found anywhere in a disturbed area. And then depending on what you find, reporting it to iMapInvasives. So if you go out and do these surveys and you don't find anything, submitting a not detected record, as well as stating about how long you spent doing your survey. This helps to see how thoroughly these areas have been surveyed in the past. If a record says that it's not detected for a certain species and it was surveyed for an hour, we got a pretty good idea that it's very likely not going to be found there. And then, of course, if you do find something, take a picture of it and submit it the same way. If you have a grid square already and you need assistance finding it from that main dashboard, there is a tool that will help you find your grid square. You can also sign up for multiple grid squares if you have multiple areas that you're interested in. And the most important thing, do your best. Obviously, this is a volunteer effort, so we're not expecting you to go out there every week and survey an entire square kilometer. Just do the best that you're able to in your invasive species surveys. And then again, mentioning that the Grid Square map is different from the main iMap interface. So once you log into your account and you see that map of the North America, That is a separate tool. To get to the Spotted Lanternfly Grid Square page, you're going to want to go to this page to access it, nyimappinvasives.org/SLF. And like I mentioned before, there is a banner on our homepage that will bring you to this page, or you can type that in directly. And on this page, you'll find all the information that we've gone through here already. How to use IMAP, how to sign up for the grid squares, the different seasons, which isn't as relevant at this point in the year. But this is a program that we do every year. So if you're interested in it next year, I'll give you an idea of when you can expect it to start, as well as a number of other resources that will help you identify Spotted Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. There will also be a link eventually to this recorded webinar if you want to go back and see any of the information that was talked about here today. And at any point, if anybody has any questions about any of the details of the program or anything that we've talked about during the webinar, you are more than welcome to reach out to us directly by sending an email to iMapInvasives@dec.ny.gov. And then just a few takeaways from some members of the IMAP team, as well as Tom. Like you had mentioned, negative surveys are good. If you go out and don't find anything, we still want to know about it. Tip from Jen Dean, the program coordinator for the iMapInvasives team, making sure that you have your locations mapped out before you go out and conduct your surveys. Mitch O'Neill, our invasive species biologist, submitting fake species records before you go out into the field so you know how to use the tool before you're already out there. It is always a good idea. And then surveying for SLF in both urban and natural areas is good. You can find them basically anywhere at this point. So keep your eye out wherever you are. And then if you are interested in learning more about invasive species or getting more involved in volunteer efforts for invasive species surveying, monitoring, or management, we highly recommend reaching out to your local partnership for regional invasive species management. These are organizations that have programs throughout the year for different invasive species survey efforts. They have a whole host of information on all the species found within their region and can help you get more involved in volunteer efforts if you are interested. And with that, that is the end of the presentation. I just want to say thank you very much for everybody who's attended and stayed throughout the duration. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can reach out to us directly, either by email. And if anybody has any questions right now, we're going through the chat and answering any of those. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing so I can take a look at the chat.
I answered as many in the chat as I could. One thing I want to stress is that you can survey anywhere as long as you have permission. So with the IMAP user agreement, you have to have permission to be on, to survey on the property. But also on public land, it can't just be any public land. It has to be public land you have access to. So just because it's, public land doesn't mean like parks close at certain hours and things like that. And there's certain areas that are off limits to, employees only. It doesn't mean just because you're surveying you can access those areas. So it has to be areas that you have access to legally. Just keep that in mind. You have on private property you have to have permission, and public property you have to have access to those areas. So
that's a great point, Tom. And just to build off of that, that is why we recommend using the SLF Grid Square program, because all of that has been taken into account already. These squares are only over, for the most part, publicly accessible land, like your local parks or state forest area where you can go in and survey during appropriate hours.
And those grid squares have been selected for things like areas that that we can't get to, as we just don't have the staff hours to survey those areas. But there's a risk, whether it's a transportation corridor, a past find nearby, a population of Tree of Heaven, that sort of thing. There's always those grids were selected over the rest of the unselected grids for just a higher targeting, more specific survey area, just because there's more likely to be found in those areas. So. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I just saw one question here. Is there any sort of report on how they've been moving from year to year? Tom, does the ag markets put out any report of such, like a kind of a time lapse of the maps?
There's not a time lapse of the maps. I don't know if the previous maps are available on site, but it's slowly spread out from Berks County, Pennsylvania, to New York, and then slowly from Staten Island in 2020 out to the rest of the state over the past 4 years. So this year, like I said, we've recently added Livingston County as well as Seneca County.
And you can sort of get a time lapse on iMapInvasives. You can use the filter options to filter for a specific year. So you can go through year by year. I think there also is a built-in time lapse feature. So you can select a certain species and it will show you how the species have kind of been added to the database over time in that way. I haven't played too much with that feature, but I'm pretty sure that's a publicly accessible one if you log in.
And someone had asked about it was in the chat, but someone had asked if the Cornell site had information on management, how to remove egg masses and get rid of them. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any getting rid of these pests, but we can certainly reduce their populations and slow them down. But there's management options on the Cornell Integrated Pest Management site as far as management options. So.
And then I did see one question here about, are you able to enter data that was collected a few weeks ago? You are able to select the date for when you're uploading either a not detected or a presence record. You can select the date that the survey occurred. So if it was from a couple of weeks ago, you can set the date as a couple of weeks ago and upload it just the same. If you're having trouble navigating the Grid Square website, it is easier on a computer or laptop, just having the bigger screen. But again, there is on that top bar, like the menu on the left side, there is the Find My Grid Square that should help you navigate to a grid square that you have claimed. All right. And if we don't have any more questions, then again, I would just like to thank everybody very much for participating and attending our webinar. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to reach out to iMapInvasives at any time. And we look forward to seeing any data that you might be collecting during the fall season. And yeah, I think that's just about it.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for participating, and thanks for being willing to go out and survey.